As data science leaders, we often need to think about logical argumentation and bringing rationality into the work that we do. And sometimes that may even be against the grain of the rest of our organizations. Here to give us a big picture view of rationality is the Johnstone Professor of Psychology at Harvard University, Professor Steven Pinker.
Thank you very much. Human rationality poses a puzzle. On the one hand, why are my slides advancing without me? On the one hand, our species can claim stupendous feats of rationality. We have traveled to the moon and taken pictures of our home planet. We have mapped the cosmos, plumbed the nature of life and mind. We have pushed back against the horsemen of the apocalypse, reducing the toll of death and suffering from the historical scourges of humanity, including war, famine, poverty, and child mortality. At the same time, a majority of Americans age 18 to 24 think that astrology is very or sort of scientific. Large proportions believe in conspiracy theories, such as that the COVID-19 vaccine actually consists of microchips implanted by a conspiracy headed by Bill Gates to surveil the world's population, or that the American deep state houses a cabal of cannibalistic, Satan-worshipping pedophiles. Many people fall for fake news, such as Joe Biden calls Trump supporters dregs of society, or Yoko Ono, I had an affair with Hillary Clinton in the 70s. And many believe in various forms of paranormal woo-woo, such as possession by the devil, extrasensory perception, ghosts and spirits, witches, and spiritual energy in mountains, trees, and crystals. So how do we resolve the paradox of how the same species can harbor so much reason and rationality and at the same time so much poppycock? That was the goal of my book, Rationality: What It Is, Why It Seems Scarce, Why It Matters. So let's begin at the beginning. What is rationality? I think the most concise definition is the use of knowledge to pursue goals. And my favorite characterization of this, the essence of rationality, comes from one of my predecessors and the namesake of the building that I work in at Harvard University, the philosopher and psychologist William James, who tried to put his finger on the difference between an agent that we would call rational and an entity that would engage in superficially similar behavior, but to which we would deny rationality. Here's how he characterizes the difference. Romeo wants Juliet as the filings want the magnet. And if no obstacles intervene, he moves toward her by as straight a line as they. But Romeo and Juliet, if a wall be built between them, do not remain idiotically pressing their faces against the opposite sides like the magnet and filings with a card. Romeo soon finds a circuitous way, by scaling the wall or otherwise, of touching Juliet's lips directly. With the filings, the path is fixed. Whether it reaches the end depends on accidents. With the lover, it is the end which is fixed. The path may be modified indefinitely. That's rationality. It raises the question of how can knowledge be used to attain goals, and the standard answer would be in a set of normative models, that is, models for how an ideal reasoner ought to reason, and each one of which serves as a benchmark against which we can define and measure common human fallacies. I have argued that every educated person should grasp the rudiments of these 7 normative models or tools of reasoning. The most basic is logic, allowing us to pursue the goal of deducing new true propositions from existing ones, and avoiding fallacies like affirming the consequent, as in every creative genius was laughed at in his time. People laugh at my ideas, therefore I am a creative genius. Probability allows us to assess the likelihood of an event as the number of occurrences as a proportion of the number of opportunities, allowing us to avoid fallacies such as the availability bias, according to which the subjective likelihood of an event depends on how easily you can bring anecdotes and images to mind. Illustrated in the following SMBC cartoon, the caption is, "This is why people should learn statistics," and the woman says, "I will not fly in a plane. They aren't safe from terrorists. Hold on, I'll text you an article about it." Bayes' rule. We should give credence to a hypothesis to the extent that it is credible a priori, it's consistent with the evidence, and the evidence is uncommon across the board, helping us to avoid fallacies such as base rate neglect, as in the physician who told a worried mother that her young daughter probably had Tourette's syndrome because she twitched, ignoring the fact that the base rate of Tourette's syndrome in the population is low, whereas the rate of twitches is high. So a child who twitches almost certainly does not have Tourette's syndrome. The theory of rational choice or expected utility. A rational actor chooses the option with the greatest expected utility, that is the sum of the probabilities of different outcomes times their payoffs, allowing us to avoid common fallacies like buying extended warranties. Where if you think about the typical cost of an appliance, the cost of an extended warranty, often 25% of the cost of the product, and the likelihood that the appliance would need to be replaced, you might think twice about taking out a life insurance policy on your toaster, as about 30% of Americans do. More consequentially, we could think that the amount of time that we save in checking a text while we drive, and the value that we get out of that compared to the utility that we place on our life with a certain probability of dying would mean that you probably should not check your texts while driving or crossing the street. The theory of signal detection or statistical decisions. A fallible observer can't know whether an observation is real, namely signal, or bogus, that is noise, and must set a decision cutoff that trades off misses and false alarms according to their costs. Having that concept at your fingertips could help avoid fallacies such as, we should deal with misconduct by making it easier to convict the accused, which indeed will result in more guilty people being punished, and it will also result in more innocent people being punished if all you're doing is lowering the threshold without improving the accuracy of your forensics. Game theory, which allows us to pursue the goal of making rational choices when the payoffs depend on someone else's rational choices, which can help us avoid fallacies such as, we can avoid climate change if we just convince everyone that it's in their interest to conserve, because no one wants to live on a hotter planet. The problem is, it actually isn't in any individual's interest to conserve, because your sacrifices alone can't save the planet, whereas you suffer all of the costs of waiting for the bus in the rain while your neighbors are driving in their air-conditioned SUVs. It is only if everyone simultaneously makes the choice to conserve that all of us benefit. Finally, the theory of causal inference. To distinguish causation from correlation, one must manipulate the putative cause, holding all else constant, helping us avoid fallacies like failing to rule out confounds. My favorite example of this comes from an old Jewish joke in which a sexually unsatisfied couple approaches their rabbi for advice, because it is written in the Talmud that a man is responsible for his wife's sexual satisfaction. Well, the rabbi strokes his beard and he says, well, here's an idea. The next time you make love, hire a young, handsome, strapping man to wave a towel over you, and the fantasies will help the wife achieve satisfaction. Well, they try it, and the earth didn't move. Nothing happened. So they go back to the rabbi. He strokes his beard again, and he says, well, this time let's try a slight variation. This time we'll have the young man make love to your wife, and you wave the towel. Well, they try that, and sure enough, she has an ecstatic screaming orgasm. And the husband says to the young man, "Schmuck. Now that's the way you wave a towel." That's an example of failing to rule out confounds. Okay, so these are 7 benchmarks for rationality. How does human cognition measure up? Well, let me give you a couple of examples. The first from logic. This is a highly reliable laboratory phenomenon. It has been demonstrated in countless labs and classrooms since the mid-60s. And we'll try it with you right now. Every card in this deck has a number on one side and a letter on the other. Here's a possible rule. If a card has a D on one side, then it has a 3 on the other. What is the smallest number of cards that you have to turn over to test the rule? There's a card with a D, a card with an F, a card with a 3, and a card with a 7. Okay, so which ones do you have to turn over to determine whether the rule, if D, then 3, is true? As I said, it's been tried literally hundreds of times, but maybe thousands. And a majority of people say that you have to turn over the D card or the D card and the 3 card. The correct answer is you have to turn over the D card and the 7 card. Why? Well, if you turn over the D card and there isn't a 3 on the other side, you falsified the rule, and everyone knows that. Everyone also knows that there's no point turning over the F card because the rule doesn't say anything about an F one way or another. Now, many people think you have to turn over the 3 card, but when you think about it, that is irrelevant because the rule says if D, then 3, not if 3, then D. Thinking you have to turn it over is an example of affirming the consequent. And when you think about it, you really do have to turn over the 7 card, because if you did and it had a D on the other side, that would falsify the rule, but it doesn't occur to people. A common explanation is that this is an example of confirmation bias, that people seek evidence that confirms, but fail to seek out evidence that might falsify their hypotheses. Here's an example from Bayesian inference. Again, a classroom chestnut. The probability that a woman has breast cancer is 1%. If a woman does have the disease, the probability that she tests positive is 90%. That's the sensitivity of the test. If she doesn't have the disease, the probability that she nevertheless tests positive is 9%. That's the false positive or false alarm rate. A woman tests positive. What is the chance that she actually has cancer? Okay? The most popular answer among a sample of doctors is 80 to 90%. The correct answer, according to Bayes' rule, is 9%. Yes, your doctor almost certainly misinterprets the result of a life and death medical test. A common explanation is one that I mentioned before, base rate neglect, that people ignore the priors, in this case the rarity of the disease in the population, and they base their judgments on a representative stereotype, such as a person with the disease testing positive. Well, what do these fallacies show? One conclusion associated with Mr. Spock is humans are irrational. But not so fast. Here's a twist on a logic problem. Consider the rule: if a bar patron is drinking beer, he must be over 21. You're a bouncer in a bar and you have to enforce the rule. Who do you have to check? There's a guy drinking beer. Do you have to card him and find out how old he is? There's a guy drinking Coke. Do you have to card him and see how old he is? There's a guy who's clearly over 21. Do you have to peer into his cup to see what he's drinking? And there's a guy who's clearly under 21. Do you have to check out what he's drinking? Well, everyone knows you've got to check the age of the person drinking beer. You've got to check the beverage of the person under 21. But that is identical to the card selection problem, if D, then 3, but this time everyone is a perfect logician. A common explanation, or a little bit circular, is called the content effect. Namely, people indeed are illogical when confronted with abstract symbols, but they can be logical with certain kinds of meaningful content, in particular obligations and precautions. Here's a twist on the probability problem. 10 in every 1,000 women have breast cancer. Of these 10 women, 9 will test positive. Of the 990 women without breast cancer, about 89 will nevertheless test positive. A woman tests positive, what is the chance that she actually has the disease? Well, now it seems pretty obvious. Well, 98 test positive in all, 9 of them have cancer. 9 out of 98 is about 9%. Now, 87% of doctors get it right. You still have to wonder about the other 13%, and that's all hope. I think we can all hope that it isn't ours. And even a majority of 10-year-olds get it right when you reframe the problem in these terms. The explanation is that there is a crucial distinction between natural frequencies, that is, proportion of visualizable events, versus single event probabilities, the probability that something is true about one person or one event. And indeed, single event probabilities are deeply weird, even according to many mathematicians and philosophers of probability. What does it actually mean to say that the probability that she has cancer is 9%? Either she has it or she doesn't. What does probability have to do with it? That's more or less the way typical humans think. They have a lot of trouble with this exotic concept that we educated professionals are familiar with of the probability of one event. When it is reframed in terms of frequencies, proportion in a set, then it becomes much more intuitive. So a better conclusion about human rationality than Mr. Spock's is that people use ecological rationality. This has nothing to do with going green or hugging a tree. Ecological in the sense of what functions in a natural environment. So people can be logical in reasoning about content relevant to their lives, although commingled with their subject matter knowledge. And they can estimate probabilities as they encounter sequences of events in their lives. People have more trouble with formal rationality. That is, they haven't mastered abstract rules and formulas that can apply to any content, familiar or unfamiliar. A powerful set of tools, but it's the formal rules that don't come naturally to us. These must be learned in school and consciously deployed. Well, this is the question that everyone asks me when I make the case for human rationality or say that I'm teaching or writing about it. If people can be rational, why does humanity seem to be losing its mind? How do you explain the QAnon and the astrology and the paranormal woo-woo and the fake news? It's not an easy question to answer, and I think there are at least 4 psychological factors at work. One of them is the phenomenon of motivated reasoning. Remember that I defined rationality as the use of knowledge to pursue a goal. Well, that goal is not necessarily objective truth. It could also be to win an argument in which the stakes matter to you. As Upton Sinclair said, it is very hard to get a man to understand something when his livelihood depends on not understanding it. It could be to show how wise and moral your group is, your religion, your tribe, your political sect, and how stupid and evil the opposing one is. This is called the my side bias, and the psychologist Keith Stanovich presents evidence that it may be the most powerful and pervasive among the 200 or so cognitive biases that psychologists have documented. It's one of the few biases that is independent of intelligence. And in pursuit of that goal, the sub-goal might be to gain status and avoid ostracism as a hero for your side. Let me give you an example. Is this syllogism valid? If college admissions are fair, then affirmative action laws are no longer necessary. College admissions are not fair, therefore affirmative action laws are necessary. Is that a valid syllogism in the sense, does the conclusion follow logically from the premises? The answer is no, that this is a fallacy of denying the antecedent, going from P implies Q to not P implies not Q, which is not valid. In surveys, a majority of liberals, people on the left, commit the fallacy, a majority of conservatives do not. Now, if you ask a conservative what's going on, they'll say, well, it's obvious. We told you all along. Liberals are irrational. But how about this syllogism? If less severe punishments deter people from committing crime, capital punishment should not be used. Less severe punishments do not deter people from committing crime. Therefore, capital punishment should be used. Well, this too is a fallacious argument. It's an example, another example of denying the antecedent. This time, a majority of conservatives commit the fallacy and a majority of liberals get it right. Of course, what's going on in both cases is that everyone simply affirms the conclusion that they or their side believe to be correct in the first place, and the validity of the arguments just go over their heads. The second part of the explanation of human irrationality comes from deeply rooted folk intuitions, ways of understanding the world that served our ancestors well for millennia, such as dualism, the idea that a person has a body and they have a mind. That is, when we deal with each other, we don't treat each other as meat puppets or robots or wind-up dolls. We infer that the people that we're dealing with have a mind like ours, even though we can't experience it directly. Well, from there, it's a short step to assume that there can be minds without bodies. And that can lead to belief in spirits and souls and ghosts and an afterlife and reincarnation and ESP. Another deeply rooted intuition is essentialism, that living things contain an invisible essence or stuff that gives them their form and powers. From there, it's a short step to believe that disease is caused by an adulteration of one's essence by some foreign contaminant. And hence you get resistance to vaccines, which, when you think about it, consists of actually taking a version of the thing that makes you sick in the first place and injecting it into your flesh. It's not surprising that resistance to vaccines is as old as vaccines themselves, and that they should still give many people the creeps. Likewise, genetically modified organisms repeatedly shown to be perfectly harmless, but it feels like adulterating the pure essence of a food with something foreign. It also makes people susceptible to homeopathy and herbal remedies, which seem to be transferring the essence of a healthful substance into the body, and to various kinds of quackery, like purging, bloodletting, fasting, and getting rid of toxins, where somehow you squeeze or expel the contaminant out of the body. Then there's the intuition of teleology. We know that our plans and artifacts are designed with a purpose. From there is a short step to assume that the world is designed with a purpose, and to believe in creationism and astrology and synchronicity, and the vague Oprah-esque sense that everything happens for a reason. Third part of the explanation as to why irrationality seems so rampant. These folk intuitions are unlearned, and more objective, sound ways of understanding the world are acquired only by trusting legitimate expertise. Scientists, historians, journalists, government. Few of us, I would say none of us, have enough scientific sophistication to reproduce for ourselves correct theories of how the world works. And indeed, surveys of scientific literacy have shown that creationists and climate deniers are no less scientifically literate than believers. They know no less, they commit no more fallacies. The only difference is in their political ideology. The further to the right, the more denial of climate and evolution. So these weird beliefs persist in people who don't trust the establishment, who think of scientists and public health agents and government experts as just another priesthood of self-interested partisans. Final part of the explanation of why people believe weird things is, it depends what you mean by believe. Beliefs come in two forms. On the one hand, there are beliefs in the reality zone. This is the world of the physical objects around us, the other people that we deal with face to face, the memory of our interactions. It's how we can keep food in the fridge and gas in the car and a roof over our heads and the kids clothed and fed and off to school on time. Beliefs in this zone are testable, and they're held if they're true. They have to be. Food doesn't get into the fridge by itself. It's only if you have a sound understanding of the world that you can survive in the unforgiving world of physical objects. But then there's the mythology zone, as I call it, the distant past, the unknowable future. faraway peoples and places, remote corridors of power, what really happens in the Kremlin or the White House or 10 Downing Street or the headquarters of ExxonMobil, the microscopic, the cosmic, the counterfactual, the metaphysical. Beliefs in this zone are held because they're entertaining, they're uplifting, they're empowering, they're morally edifying. Whether they are true or false is, for most people, unknowable anyway and kind of irrelevant. You should hold beliefs based on whether they lead to the morally correct conclusions. Examples are religious belief, which almost by definition is a matter of faith, not reason or evidence. Myths about the great heroes and martyrs that founded our glorious nation, which historians often show are truthy at best. Fake news and conspiracy theories. Let me just give you one concrete example from the cognitive psychologist Hugo Mercier. There was a predecessor to QAnon, which many of you may recall, called Pizzagate. This was the theory that Hillary Clinton ran a pedophilia ring out of the basement of a Washington, D.C. pizzeria called Cosmic Ping Pong. Now, how do people who believe this theory actually respond to it? Well, a typical response was to leave a 1-star review on Yelp, such as the dough was incredibly underbaked and suspicious-looking men were giving funny looks at my 4-year-old son. Now, this is not the response that you would have if you literally thought that children were being raped in the basement. Presumably, you'd call the police. So what does "I believe that Hillary Clinton ran a child sex ring" really mean? Well, what a good translation is, I believe Hillary Clinton is so depraved that she's capable of running a child sex ring, and how do we know she isn't? And I think an even more accurate translation of that belief would be, Hillary, boo. In other words, beliefs can be expressions of moral convictions, not actual commitment to a factual state of affairs. So when Bertrand Russell said, "It is undesirable to believe a proposition when there is no ground whatsoever for supposing it is true," he was not saying anything that is kind of obvious or banal. He was making a radical, unnatural manifesto. This is not the way that most people think about beliefs in the mythology zone. Well, it raises the natural question, how can we become more rational? To begin with, I do think that the tools of formal rationality, those 7 normative models that I introduced at the beginning of the talk, should become second nature to educated people. That rationality should be the 4th R, together with reading, writing, and arithmetic. As in the headline from the satirical newspaper, The Onion, CDC announces plan to send every US household pamphlet on probabilistic thinking. Not a bad idea. Second, it isn't enough to promote these ideas in school, because as we all know, most students forget everything in the course as soon as the ink is dry on their exam. But norms of rationality have to be promoted in our everyday discourse, in politics, in the media, in conversation. Avoidance of fallacies like the availability bias, the my-side bias, arguing ad hominem should be promoted. And basing beliefs on evidence, changing your mind when the evidence changes, should be seen as signs of strength, not weakness. Third, and crucially, institutions with their rationality-promoting rules must be safeguarded, because none of us is rational enough to make the world more rational on our own, even collectively. But in institutions with rules that promote rationality, one person can notice and make up for another's biases, and make us collectively more rational than any of us could possibly be individually. Let me give you an example, a very simple example. In that logical card selection test, people working alone, about 1 in 10 get it right, as I mentioned. As soon as you put people in small groups, 7 out of the 10 groups get it right. All it takes is for one person to spot the correct answer, and they virtually always convince their group mates of the correct answer. What do I mean by rationality promoting institutions? Well, science with its demand for empirical testing and peer review, democratic governance with its checks and balances, journalism with the demand for editing and fact-checking, the judicial system with its adversarial proceedings, academia with, at least in theory, if not always in practice, the commitment to freedom of inquiry and open debate, and even Wikipedia, surprisingly accurate, despite an unpromising set of premises, has turned out to be remarkably neutral and objective thanks to canonizing those principles as rules that all Wikipedians are committed to. In comparison, social media without these guardrails, not so much. What it implies is that the credibility and objectivity of rationality promoting institutions must be safeguarded. Experts should be prepared to show their work. Fallibility should be acknowledged as not as a sign of weakness, but as a sign of commitment to the truth. And gratuitous politicization should be avoided. Increasingly, we see our scientific journals, our public science institutions, our universities, basically advocating a identifiable left-wing political view. If they do that, they should not be surprised when the right and the center blow them off. Finally, why rationality matters. Rationality matters to our lives. And a number of studies have shown that people who follow the normative models and avoid cognitive fallacies, on average, get into fewer accidents and mishaps, have better financial, health, and employment outcomes, and are less likely to be swindled by medical or psychic charlatans. Second, rationality drives material progress. In an earlier book called Enlightenment Now, I showed with data that longevity, peace, prosperity, safety, quality of life, just about anything that you could measure, have increased over time. People ask me, oh, so that must mean you believe in progress. Well, actually, I don't. As the humorist Fran Lebowitz once said, I don't believe in anything you have to believe in. We didn't progress by some mysterious force that lifts us ever upward. In fact, the laws of the universe kind of grind us down. We achieve progress by deploying reason to improve human flourishing. Finally, and less obviously, I end the book by arguing that rationality drives moral progress. In The Better Angels of Our Nature, I discovered to my surprise that many moral movements began with a rational argument, that some moral or political leader called out a contradiction between the practices of the day and values that people of the time claimed to hold. The argument would get reprinted in pamphlets and newspapers and books. They would go viral, be discussed in salons and coffee houses and pubs, and work their way into the elites and then become the law of the land. So let me end with a few examples. Did people really need a rational argument as to why something may not be so rational about religious persecution, such as burning heretics? The answer is they did. And it was first made by leaders such as Sebastian Castellio, who said, Calvin says that he is certain, and other sects say that they are. Who shall be the judge? In view of the uncertainty, we must define the heretic simply as one with whom we disagree. And if then we are going to kill heretics, the logical outcome will be a war of extermination, since each is sure of himself, pointing out the confirmation bias and the my side bias. How about sadistic forms of corporal and capital punishment, like breaking on the wheel or disembowelment? Well, the arguments against it were laid out by Cesare Beccaria, the first rational choice theorist, who said, as punishments become more cruel, the minds of men, which like fluids always adjust to the level of the objects that surround them, become hardened. And after 100 years of cruel punishments, breaking on the wheel causes no more fear than imprisonment previously did. For a punishment to achieve its objective, it is only necessary that the harm it inflicts outweighs the benefit that derives from the crime. And into this calculation ought to be factored the certainty of the punishment and the loss of the good that the commission of the crime would produce. Everything beyond this is superfluous and therefore tyrannical, the theory of expected utility stated verbally instead of mathematically. How about war? Did people need an argument that war is not healthy for children and other living things? Indeed they did, and Erasmus formulated it in the 15th century. The advantages derived from peace diffuse themselves far and wide and reach great numbers, while in war, if anything turns out happily, the advantage redounds only to a few. One man's safety is owing to the destruction of another. One man's prize is derived from the plunder of another. The cause of rejoicings made by one side is to the other a cause of mourning. Whatever is unfortunate in war is severely so indeed, and whatever, on the contrary, is called good fortune is a savage and a cruel good fortune, an ungenerous happiness deriving its existence from another's woe. In other words, the theory of zero-sum games from game theory. What about autocracy, such as the divine right of kings? Well, John Locke argued, we are born free as we are born rational. Freedom of men under government is to have a standing rule to live by, common to every one of that society and made by the legislative power erected in it. A liberty to follow my own will in all things where that rule prescribes not to be subject to the inconstant, uncertain, arbitrary, unknown will of another man, as freedom of nature is to be under no other restraint but the law of nature. Not surprisingly, this led a century later to the first democracy. Perhaps more surprisingly, it helped launch the first feminist. Mary Astell, not long after Locke, said, if absolute sovereignty be not necessary in a state, how comes it to be so in a family? Or, if in a family, why not in a state? Since no reason can be alleged for the one that will not hold more strongly for the other. If all men are born free, how is it that all women are born slaves? As they must be if the being subjected to the inconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of men, sound familiar, be the perfect condition of slavery, insistence on logical consistency. Speaking of slavery, could that most atrocious of institutions actually have needed an argument to refute it? Well, they were provided by Frederick Douglass, who pointed out, among other things, there are 72 crimes in the state of Virginia which, if committed by a black man, subject him to the punishment of death, while only 2 of the same crimes will subject a white man to the like punishment. What is this but the acknowledgement that the slave is a moral, intellectual, and responsible being? The manhood of the slave is conceded. It is admitted in the fact that the Southern statute books are covered with enactments forbidding, under severe fines and penalties, the teaching of the slave to read or write. When you can point to any such laws in reference to the beasts of the field, then I may consent to argue the manhood of the slave. Again, logical consistency. Finally, I would suggest that reason should guide movements for change. It makes the difference between moral force and brute force, between marches for justice and lynch mobs, between human progress and just breaking things. And it will be needed to ensure that moral progress continue, that the abominable practices of our own time will come to be seen by our descendants as indefensible as burning at the stake and slave auctions seem to us. Finally, I'll just conclude with the claim that the power of rationality to guide moral progress is of a piece with its power to guide material progress and wise choices in our lives, namely the use of objective, detached analysis to lift ourselves out of our parochial vantage points and to grasp objective truths that may be alien to our intuitions, but true for all that. Thank you. Thank you. And are there any questions? I think we have 2 runners with microphones. So the microphone will find the questioner. The questioner does not have to find the microphone. Sorry, are you asking a question or are you putting on your coat, or both? Well, there should be a microphone should find itself, find its way to you. There you go.
Yeah, thanks very much. Very thought-provoking. It took me a long time to buy into the Dunning-Kruger effect from the colleagues at Cornell. And I don't know, the last 5 or 10 years, I started to believe it. And more recently, there's been some studies that suggest that it's not accurate. Could you comment on that, if you don't mind?
Yes, so the Dunning-Kruger effect is the effect by which less intelligent people are less aware of their own propensity to make errors. So it's the duller people who are unaware that they are that they commit fallacies, that they are in fact duller. That when you get smarter, one of the things that you realize is that you yourself make mistakes. So it turns out that it's too good to be true, as some effects are, that attempts to replicate it with larger samples fail to find it. That basically it may be more of an artifact of regression to the mean, which is to say that if you're worse than average, you think that you're a little not quite as off from the correct answer. If you're much better than average, you think that you're not as good as you in fact are. But it's a symmetrical effect, and just what you'd expect if people tend to assess their own abilities as closer to the mean, which you would observe even if there was some randomness or noise in such judgments. So sadly, it was an effect that was too cute to be true. Anyone else? Yes, I think I see a hand at the back.
What do you think about Elon Musk buying Twitter?
I guess we didn't need a mic. What do I think of Elon Musk buying Twitter? I think that a number of things. I mean, Twitter as a private company is, of course, not bound by the First Amendment, but because it has become de facto a public square, it certainly has a responsibility to promote free speech, and that we have reason to believe, thanks to investigations that Musk enabled after he bought the company, that Twitter was colluding with law enforcement agencies to repress certain expression of opinions that it deemed to be disinformation, which then spread to repressing a number of politically incorrect, unwoke beliefs, and probably distorted the public sphere. So it is indeed probably beneficial that Twitter not constrain the range of opinions that are expressed. On the other hand, that itself isn't enough to promote more reliable opinions, ones with greater documentation behind them, with a greater likelihood of being true. And that ought to be something that within the large tent of freedom of expression, there should be, in general, a biasing toward accuracy as opposed to inaccuracy, where the accuracy is not defined as consistency with a particular ideology, but nonpartisan accuracy. And it's also confounded by the fact that Musk himself has such an abrasive, needlessly provocative persona that people are confusing being able to express yourself with kind of being an asshole. Those should not be conflated, but that is a tendency, including a former president of the United States who kind of conflated just sheer rudeness, obnoxiousness with truthfulness, and those are not the same thing. I mean, you could even have it as a kind of a fallacy of affirming the consequent. It is true that many people who say true things are obnoxious or offend people. The converse, that offensive and obnoxious people are likelier to speak the truth, does not follow. Yeah. Wait, I think a microphone will...
As an entity trying to be more and more rational, how would you reconcile the ideologies between the left and the right when both are sort of reasonable? How do you sort of reconcile the different directions that?
Well, they can't kind of both be reasonable about everything, because often they contradict each other. But I think we should be mindful of the my side bias, that it is powerful, that as best we can tell, it's symmetrical, that there are some psychologists who have tried to show that it is more prominent on the right, and it might be, but a lot of those studies were themselves victims of the my side bias. It depends on which items you select, which groups you identify as potential targets of prejudice, for example. So it is true that people on the right are more likely to be racist and prejudiced against African Americans. Turns out that people on the left are more likely to be prejudiced against fundamentalist Christians, but it hadn't occurred to social psychologists to pose the question that way. So it is a bias that kind of a tribalist or my side bias that we're all vulnerable to, and that, as those logical syllogisms showed, can cloud our reason. I talk about another example in the book of a study showing that empirical reasoning as well, distinguishing correlation from causation, can lead to systematic errors from political bias, that even mathematically sophisticated people will misinterpret statistical data in the direction of the position that that their political tribe believes to be true. So it's one of the fallacies, like affirming the consequent, like sunk cost, like availability bias, like confirmation bias, that we have to be mindful of, and that our institutions ought to have norms and safeguards against becoming entrenched. And this has not been happening with our scientific organizations. They're happy to be kind of sucked into the left, oblivious to the fact that they themselves, as human beings, like everyone, can be subject to distorted judgments based on their political priors. And I have a collection, but we'll not mention them further here. Yes?
What do you do in your own personal life to pierce your own mimetic bubble?
My own what level?
Your own bubble, or...
Oh, I try to listen to other people, including people I don't like. I read bad reviews. I send out drafts of chapters to peers who won't be personal or nasty, but will point out when I'm wrong. I'll try to step outside myself, something that I realize I can't do as much as I should, but trying to do it is better than not trying to do it, realizing that I'm a human being. I'm not, from the inside, it always feels like you're right, and it always does feel like I'm right. But at the same time, I have the meta-awareness that probably sometimes I know I'm right and I'm not right. So I try to just sort of keep that in mind. I look at my own behavioral choices and try to spot the ones that are indefensible. I used to take more chances in bicycling, for example. I used to, particularly when Rationality came out a bit more than a year ago, and many journalists said, okay, where are you irrational in your own life? Well, even having to answer that question helped me to spot a number of indefensible habits that I had, that having to answer that question, then I could deal with them more rationally. So for example, I have a tremendous irrational fear of being early. If I'm at an airport and it's like, 20 minutes before I have to board the flight, it's like, wow, what could I have done with those 20 minutes? The answer is probably very little that I couldn't have done at the airport, like check my email. But nonetheless, I am constantly in danger of missing flights. If I do miss a flight, the cost of missing the flight is way higher than the benefit of saving all of those 5 minutes here and 10 minutes there. Drives my wife, who is a philosopher and highly rational, crazy. But even answering the question, what do you do that's irrational, is one way that I hope to become a little less irrational. Yeah.
Are there any logical fallacies that you think AI might be most susceptible to?
Logical fallacies that AI must be most susceptible to. Probably not logical fallacies insofar as at least the current generation of AI doesn't really work with logical reasoning the way classical, good old-fashioned AI did. Now, since it's all a statistical kind of mélange, the fallacies come from perhaps not being cognizant of the difference between a statistical mélange and an actual fact, as we see with all of the confabulations and hallucinations. Probably, especially in large language models in particular, but in so-called deep learning neural network error backpropagation models more generally, the fact that they don't have any facts in them, they don't have any logical propositions, they just have statistical intercorrelations, makes hallucinations and confabulations almost a necessity. And if we want AI that, say, is going to be useful for a lawyer in making a brief without making up a bunch of non-existent cases, as we just learned about yesterday, then I suspect that more AI that's a little more I and less A will have to figure out a way of reintroducing logic and propositions, subjects and predicates, facts, entities, causal relations, all the things that current AI models tend to eschew and substitute instead the statistical correlations from gargantuan data sets.
Professor Pinker, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.